In the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, Thomas Redcloud lives alone in a cave, far from the reservation and farther still from the white man's world that took everything from him. His only companions are silence, memories, and the ancient spirits that whisper through the canyon walls. For 15 years, no human has crossed his threshold. The locals know to stay away from the mad Apache, leaving him to his solitude and survival. But when a sudden storm brings unexpected company, a woman with determination in her eyes and wounds that match his own, Thomas faces a choice. Can he risk opening his world to another soul when the last time nearly destroyed him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the Dragoon Mountains, painting the sandstone in hues of amber and gold. Thomas Redcloud emerged from his cave, medicine pouch hanging from his neck as it had every morning for 15 years. The small leather bag contained sacred items: eagle feather, white sage, a polished stone from his grandfather, and a tiny silver cross that belonged to his wife. Items that bridged worlds, just as he once had. Thomas moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had stripped life to its essentials. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, not even to himself. At 62, his body remained lean and weathered like the juniper trees that dotted the canyon. His long gray-streaked hair hung in a single braid down his back, face etched with lines that mapped a lifetime of joy and sorrow. The morning ritual never varied. Check the snares. Gather water from the spring. Tend the small garden of corn, beans, and squash hidden on a south-facing ledge. Listen to the canyon. The canyon always spoke to those patient enough to hear. Today it whispered of change. Thomas paused at the edge of his territory, dark eyes scanning the horizon. The desert sky had shifted overnight, clouds gathering in the west like unwelcome visitors. Weather was coming. Bad weather. 2 days, he murmured, tasting the moisture in the air. The first words he'd spoken aloud in a week. He returned to the cave. Not just a shelter but a home he'd crafted with deliberate care. The main chamber stretched 30 feet into the mountain, with smaller rooms branching off like fingers. Nature had created the space. Thomas had refined it. Stone tools organized on a ledge. Herbs hanging from the ceiling to dry. Bedding of woven grass mats covered with rabbit furs. A fire pit vented through a natural chimney. Simple. Sufficient. Against the far wall stood a carved wooden chest, the only item he'd carried from his former life. Thomas rarely opened it. As he sorted through gathered plants, his mind drifted to before. Before the cave. Before the solitude. Before the loss. He had been Thomas Redcloud, tribal police lieutenant, respected in 2 worlds. College-educated but traditionally trained by his grandfather, a medicine man. Married to Anna, a reservation schoolteacher with Hopi blood and eyes that crinkled when she laughed. Father to Michael, a boy who could run like the wind. That life ended on a rainy Tuesday 15 years ago. Thomas pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the approaching storm. The chest would stay closed today. By midday, the wind had picked up, bending the scrub brush and whistling through the canyon. Thomas secured his outside belongings and gathered extra firewood. Desert storms were unpredictable, sometimes mere bluster, sometimes biblical in their intensity. He'd witnessed 3 major floods in his years here. The normally dry creek beds transformed into raging torrents within minutes, carving new paths through the ancient stone, carrying away anything or anyone foolish enough to be caught below. The nearest town of Willow Springs lay 20 miles east. Its residents knew better than to venture into the canyons when storms threatened. Tourists weren't always so wise. Thomas retreated to the cave entrance as the first fat raindrops fell. Lightning flashed across the darkened sky, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath his feet. The medicine pouch grew heavy against his chest. A warning. Something comes, he whispered to the empty air. That night, As rain hammered the earth and wind howled through the canyon, Thomas dreamed of Anna. Not the broken body he'd buried, but Anna alive and smiling, pointing toward the eastern ridge, warning him, or guiding him. Dreams had become difficult to interpret in his isolation. He woke before dawn to silence. The storm had paused, the eye passing over, not the end. The real violence was yet to come. Thomas stepped outside, surveying the transformed landscape. The normally dusty ground had turned to mud, small rivulets already forming along the paths of least resistance. Above, the clouds hung low and threatening, pregnant with unfallen rain. He needed to check the upper trail, the only route connecting his sanctuary to the world below. If it washed out, he would be truly isolated until he could forge a new path. While solitude was his choice, being trapped was another matter entirely. Thomas gathered his walking stick and a coil of rope. The medicine pouch seemed to pulse against his skin as he secured it under his shirt. Something was coming. The canyon had whispered it. The dreams had confirmed it. After 15 years of perfect solitude, change approached on the storm's wings. The storm returned with a vengeance as Thomas reached the upper trail. Wind-driven rain lashed his face while thunder cracked overhead like ancient spirits arguing. The narrow path hugging the canyon wall had already begun to crumble, small sections sliding away into the void below. Thomas secured his rope to a sturdy juniper and continued forward, testing each step. 15 years of isolation had not dulled his caution. The trail disappeared around a bend, and as he followed, the full fury of the storm revealed itself. A wall of water surged through the canyon below, brown and angry, carrying uprooted trees and debris. The normally dry creek bed had transformed into a roaring river 20 feet deep. Nature reclaiming itself with terrible efficiency. Movement caught his eye, something bright against the muddy torrent. Thomas narrowed his gaze, certain he was mistaken. There, a flash of blue tumbling in the current. Not debris, person. For a heartbeat, Thomas remained frozen. Human problems belonged to humans. He had left that world behind. But his body moved before his mind decided, scrambling down toward a lower outcropping that jutted over the flood path. The figure in blue would pass directly beneath it in moments. Thomas reached the ledge as the flood carried its victim closer. A woman, clinging to a broken tree branch, her head barely above water. She disappeared beneath the surface, then fought back up, gasping. He unwound his rope, secured one end to a boulder, and tossed the other toward the raging water. The first throw fell short. The second caught on something unseen and washed away. "Look up!" Thomas shouted, his voice rusty from disuse. Whether by miracle or chance, the woman heard. Her face turned upward, pale, determined, alive. Thomas threw the rope one final time. She reached for it with desperate fingers as the current swept her beneath the outcropping. For a terrible moment, he thought she'd missed. Then the rope went taut, nearly pulling him forward into the torrent. Thomas braced himself against the rock, muscles straining as he pulled hand over hand. The woman emerged from the flood like some primordial creature, coughing and gasping. With one final heave, he dragged her onto the ledge where she collapsed, trembling violently. She clutched something to her chest, a broken camera in a waterproof case, the strap tangled around her wrist. Even in her fight for survival, she hadn't let it go. "Thank you," she managed between ragged breaths. "I thought." "Don't talk," Thomas cut her off. "We need to move before this ledge goes too." As if to emphasize his point, a section of rock near their feet broke away, tumbling into the churning water below. The woman tried to stand but fell with a sharp cry of pain. Her left ankle was swollen, possibly broken. Thomas hesitated only briefly before lifting her. She weighed little, though her sudden proximity made him tense. It had been 15 years since he'd touched another human being. "My backpack," she said against his shoulder. "Downstream." Gone, he replied, securing the rope around them both. Like you almost were. The climb back to the upper trail tested even Thomas's strength. The woman remained silent except for occasional gasps when her injured ankle knocked against stone. Rain continued to pour, making every handhold treacherous. By the time they reached his cave, both were exhausted and soaked to the skin. Thomas set her down just inside the entrance, away from his living area. Boundaries immediately established. "Where am I?" she asked, pushing wet hair from her face. She was perhaps 40, with copper-brown hair and eyes the color of the canyon walls at sunset. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but striking, a face accustomed to expression. "My home," Thomas said, moving to the fire pit. "Temporarily. I'm Sarah," she offered. "Sarah Holloway." Thomas didn't respond as he coaxed the banked coals back to life. Names meant connection. Connection meant complication. The woman, Sarah, still clutched her broken camera. The casing had split, exposing damaged electronics and a memory card that had somehow survived. She noticed his glance. "My work," she explained. "Wildlife photography. I was documenting desert adaptations after rainfall when the storm hit. Thought I had time to get back." A humorless laugh escaped her. "Clearly, I was wrong." Thomas handed her a blanket, careful to avoid touching her fingers. "You need dry clothes. Rest. Tomorrow, when the flood recedes, I'll show you the way down to Willow Springs." Sarah winced as she shifted her injured ankle. "That might be a problem." She gestured toward her swollen joint. "And I'm guessing there's no urgent care clinic nearby." "No. Are you going to tell me your name?" Thomas turned away, gathering herbs for a poultice. "It doesn't matter. You won't be here long enough to need it." Morning brought no relief from the storm. Rain continued to fall in sheets, and distant thunder echoed through the canyon like artillery fire. Thomas stood at the cave entrance, watching a new waterfall form across the ravine. The path to town would be impassable for days, possibly weeks. He turned back to his unwanted guest. Sarah slept fitfully on a pallet of blankets near the fire, her injured ankle wrapped in a poultice of yarrow and clay. During the night, fever had taken hold, not unusual after such trauma. Thomas had treated her with herbs and clean water, careful to maintain distance even in caregiving. A small leather-bound journal had fallen from her pocket during the night. Thomas picked it up, turning it in his hands. The cover was worn smooth, suggesting frequent use. He shouldn't open it. Wouldn't want someone reading his private thoughts, if he still bothered to record them. Yet his fingers moved of their own accord, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting and small sketches of plants, animals, landscapes. Not just a photographer then, an observer, a chronicler. The most recent entry was dated yesterday. Day 17 in the Dragoons. Found a family of javelinas adapted to high-elevation living. Unusual behavior patterns compared to their desert cousins. Something powerful about watching creatures thrive where they shouldn't. Perhaps that's what draws me to these forgotten places, the stubborn persistence of life against all odds. Thomas closed the journal quickly as Sarah stirred. Her eyes opened, confusion giving way to recognition, then pain as she tried to move. "How long was I out?" she asked, voice raspy. "Nightfall to morning," Thomas replied, setting water beside her. "Drink." Sarah obeyed, studying him over the rim of the cup. "You know, most hermits I've met are more talkative." Thomas didn't smile. "You make a habit of intruding on hermits?" "Only when I'm being swept away by flash floods." She attempted to sit up, wincing. "Thank you for saving my life. And for this." She gestured to her wrapped ankle. Thomas nodded once, then moved to check the fire. Conversation over. But Sarah wasn't finished. "You're Thomas Redcloud, aren't you? The tribal policeman who disappeared after the reservation murders." His hands stilled. "Who told you that?" "No one needed to. I've been researching the Dragoon Mountain ecosystem for months. The locals mentioned a reclusive Apache living in the high canyons. Said he used to be police until tragedy struck. She paused. They didn't have details. And you won't get any from me, Thomas said flatly. He stood, gathering his rain gear. I need to check the damage. Stay by the fire. Wait. Sarah struggled to stand, balancing on her good foot. I can help. I'm not helpless. You have a sprained ankle and fever. You're the definition of helpless right now. Her chin lifted. I've survived worse. Something in her tone made Thomas pause. He recognized the look in her eyes. Someone who had walked through fire and emerged changed but unbroken. Still, it changed nothing. Rest, he said, more gently than intended. I won't be long. Outside, the world had transformed. New streams cut across familiar paths, and mudslides had altered the canyon's geography. Thomas surveyed the damage with practiced eyes, mentally calculating what it would take to restore access to the lower valley. The storm had delivered more than a half-drowned photographer. It had breached his sanctuary, forcing connection where he'd cultivated emptiness. Now he had a woman with a journal full of observations and eyes that saw too much sharing his space. When Thomas returned, Sarah had managed to prop herself up against the cave wall. She'd organized her few rescued possessions: the broken camera, a water-damaged cell phone, the journal, and a small silver locket. The trail to town, she asked without preamble. How bad? Gone in 3 places. The lower canyon is flooded. We're isolated until the water recedes and I can forge a new path. Sarah absorbed this with surprising calm. How long? A week. Maybe more. She nodded slowly. I should be able to walk by then. You should call someone, Thomas said. Let them know you're alive. Sarah smiled thinly. No reception here, I'm guessing. And no one's expecting to hear from me anyway. I filed a wilderness permit for 3 weeks. No one will look for me until I miss my check-in. Thomas frowned. You came to the mountains alone? During monsoon season, says the man who lives in a cave by himself. Her gaze softened. Sometimes solitude is necessary. You of all people should understand that. The unwelcome parallel hung between them. Thomas turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the comparison. I have one rule, he said finally. Don't ask about my past. It died long ago, and I prefer to let it rest. Sarah watched him for a long moment. Fair enough. But just so you know, whatever you're running from followed you into this cave. I can see it in every move you make. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Then you should also see that I've made peace with my ghosts. They're better company than people. 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful distance. Thomas continued his routines, modified only slightly to accommodate his unexpected guest. He brought water, prepared simple meals, changed Sarah's poultice twice daily, and spent most daylight hours outside the cave, repairing what damage he could, hunting, gathering. Sarah, for her part, respected his silence. She didn't press for conversation or personal revelations. Instead, she observed, noted the precise organization of his few possessions. The small altar of stones near the back wall. The way he always paused before entering or leaving, as if crossing an invisible threshold between worlds. By the 3rd evening, her fever had broken, and she could put weight on her ankle for short periods. Thomas found her at the cave entrance, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls. The swelling's going down, she said as he approached. Your medicine worked. Thomas nodded. Yarrow, arnica, white willow bark. Native remedies. Effective remedies, he corrected, setting down freshly caught rabbits. Nature provides what's needed if you know where to look. Sarah smiled slightly. For sentences. A new record. Thomas almost smiled back, a reflex long dormant. He caught himself and turned to prepare the rabbits for cooking. Can I help? Sarah asked. He hesitated. then nodded toward a basket of wild onions and herbs. Those need cleaning. They worked in companionable silence, the simple domestic task creating an unexpected harmony. When Thomas placed a clay pot over the fire, Sarah watched his movements with genuine interest. "You've made a real home here," she observed. "Not just a shelter." Thomas added water to the pot before answering. "There's a difference between existing and living. I chose the latter. After you left everything else behind." He shot her a warning look, but she raised her hands in surrender. "Observation, not question. I'm keeping our bargain." Later, as they ate the rabbit stew under the cave's ancient ceiling, Sarah noticed a wooden object partially hidden behind a stack of firewood. She tilted her head, curious. "Is that a flute?" Thomas followed her gaze, expression unreadable. "Apache flute. Cedar. Do you play?" "Not anymore." Sarah accepted his answer without pressing. After dinner, she hobbled to her sleeping area while Thomas banked the fire for the night. The cave settled into darkness, broken only by glowing embers. "I used to play piano," Sarah's voice came softly through the dark. "Gave it up after my divorce. Some joys get lost along the way." Thomas remained silent, but he heard the offering in her words. A piece of herself volunteered without expectation of reciprocation. Strange how such a small confidence could feel like intrusion. That night, the dreams came again. Anna's face, Michael's laughter, blood on the reservation school walls. Thomas woke with a shout, sitting upright, sweat cold on his skin despite the warm night. Across the cave, Sarah lay still, but her breathing gave her away. Awake, listening, witness to his weakness. "Bad dreams?" she asked quietly. "Go back to sleep. I used to get them too. After Afghanistan." A pause. "I was a combat photographer. 2 tours. Saw things no one should see." Thomas stared into the darkness, picturing Sarah in body armor, camera in hand, documenting humanity's worst moments. It explained something about her, the steadiness, the ability to observe without flinching. "Does it help?" he asked finally. "Capturing suffering through a lens?" "No," she answered honestly. "But sometimes it makes others see what they'd rather ignore. That matters." Morning brought clearing skies and the first opportunity to truly assess the canyon's transformation. Thomas allowed Sarah to accompany him to a viewpoint near the cave, her ankle now strong enough for short walks. The landscape below had been violently rearranged. New channels cut through ancient stone. Trees uprooted. Familiar landmarks gone. "Nature's reset button," Sarah murmured, instinctively reaching for her broken camera. Creation through destruction. Thomas watched her face as she surveyed the scene, recognizing the look of someone recording images in memory when technology failed. Her eyes tracked a hawk circling above the altered terrain, adapting its hunting patterns to the new reality. "Life continues," he said simply. Sarah glanced at him. "Always does, whether we want it to or not." Their eyes met briefly before Thomas looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement of shared understanding. Both had survived cataclysms. Both had found ways to continue. As they turned back toward the cave, Thomas found himself walking more slowly to match Sarah's pace, no longer seeing her presence as an intrusion but as a temporary reality to be accommodated. Like the canyon adjusting to its new contours, perhaps he too could adapt. Just until the path to town was passable again. 5 days after the storm, Thomas returned from checking the lower trail with a troubled expression. Sarah, who had been sorting through the medicinal herbs he'd taught her to identify, recognized something had changed. "Bad news?" she asked. "The canyon floor is still flooded," he reported, setting down his walking stick. "And there's a search helicopter circling the south ridge." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Looking for me, you think? Perhaps. Or assessing storm damage." Thomas busied himself arranging kindling for the evening fire. "Either way, we should avoid drawing attention." Worried they'll discover your hermit paradise? There was no mockery in her tone, only understanding. People complicate things, he said simply. As darkness fell, temperatures dropped. The desert's cruel contradiction. Scorching days, frigid nights. Thomas built the fire higher than usual, and Sarah dragged her sleeping mat closer to the flames. "Would you mind company?" she asked, gesturing to the space beside her. "It's practical. Conservation of heat." Thomas hesitated, then nodded once, bringing his own sitting mat near the fire. The cave seemed smaller with both of them in its center, the ancient walls holding their shared warmth. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah began, watching the flames dance. "About people complicating things. You're right, of course. They do. Yet you make your living photographing them," Thomas observed. "Not usually. I prefer wildlife, landscapes, things with simple truths." She poked at the fire with a stick. "People are chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous," Thomas added quietly. Sarah studied him across the flames. "Yes, that too." She took a deep breath. "I left more than a broken marriage behind when I came to the Dragoons. I was running from a story that nearly got me killed." Thomas remained silent, waiting. "I documented water contamination on tribal lands in North Dakota. Corporate negligence, corruption, the usual story, profits over people." Her voice hardened. "Published the photos, testified before a congressional committee. Then my brakes failed on a mountain road. Police called it an accident. You didn't." "No." "So I disappeared. Changed my focus to environmental photography. Less controversial, supposedly." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Until a flash flood delivered me to the doorstep of another man who knows about disappearing." Thomas stared into the fire, weighing his response. This woman had offered her truth without demanding his in return. An unexpected gift. "My wife was a teacher," he said finally, the words feeling strange on his tongue after years of silence. "On the reservation. She and my son were killed 15 years ago." Sarah's expression showed no pity, only recognition. "I'm sorry." Thomas nodded, accepting her words. "There was a group, white supremacists. They targeted the school because it taught Apache language and traditions. Called it cultural indoctrination." His voice remained steady, though his hands had tightened into fists. 3 men with rifles. 8 people died, including Anna and Michael. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. "Did they catch them?" Sarah asked eventually. 2. The third was never found. Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes across the flames. "I was lead investigator. Tracked them for months. When justice failed, I—" He stopped, unwilling to speak the rest aloud. Even now, Sarah didn't press. Instead, she reached for her journal and tore out a blank page, folding it into a simple boat. She placed it in the fire and watched as it blackened, then flared brightly before disappearing into ash. "Apache tradition?" she asked. "No," Thomas answered, "but appropriate. Some stories are meant to burn away after telling." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He hadn't spoken of Anna and Michael in 15 years, yet the cave hadn't collapsed. The world hadn't ended again. Sarah rose carefully, testing her healing ankle, and moved to retrieve something from her few possessions. She returned with the silver locket he'd noticed earlier. "My grandmother's," she explained, opening it to reveal a faded photograph. "The only thing I kept from before." When she passed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly. Thomas looked down at the small image, a young girl beside an older woman, both smiling beneath a summer sky. "You have her eyes," he observed, returning the locket, "and her stubbornness, according to everyone who knew her." Sarah closed the locket carefully. "She taught me that memories aren't meant to be tombs we bury ourselves in. Thomas almost responded sharply, but caught himself. This wasn't judgment, just her truth, offered alongside his. As the fire burned lower, neither moved back to their separate spaces. They sat in companionable silence, the shared stories creating an unexpected bridge between them. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was soft with approaching sleep. "Thank you for telling me about them. Anna and Michael." Thomas nodded, realizing with surprise that speaking their names aloud had felt not like betrayal, but remembrance. "Rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow we'll check the southern trail." "Together?" she asked, eyes already closing. "Together," he confirmed, watching as she drifted to sleep beside the dying fire. Above them, forgotten in the shadows of a small alcove, lay a faded photograph Thomas had hidden years ago. Anna and Michael smiling beneath an Arizona sky, not so different from the image in Sarah's locket. The southern trail proved no more passable than the others. A week after the storm, Thomas and Sarah stood at the edge of a 30-foot gap where the path had once hugged the canyon wall. Below, the floodwaters had receded enough to reveal a landscape transformed. Boulders the size of cars deposited by the raging current, trees embedded like spears in the mud. "So much for that option," Sarah observed, her ankle now strong enough for longer hikes. "What's our plan B?" Thomas studied the terrain with experienced eyes. "We create a new trail. There." He pointed to a natural ledge system descending in rough switchbacks. "It will take work, but it's possible. Then let's get started." Sarah rolled up her sleeves, the gesture so matter-of-fact that Thomas almost smiled. They began by gathering stones to create markers, small cairns placed at intervals to map their intended route. Working together required few words. Thomas would indicate a suitable spot, and Sarah would arrange the stones while he scouted ahead. By midday, they had outlined the entire path from canyon rim to floor. "Not bad for a photographer and a hermit," Sarah said, wiping sweat from her brow as they paused for water. "Though I'm guessing you weren't always a cave dweller. These are ranger skills." "Tribal police," Thomas corrected. "Search and rescue training. Useful education for someone planning to disappear." She took another drink, then passed the water skin back. The irony being that those same skills might save lives now. Thomas glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Sarah nodded toward the canyon floor. "That helicopter yesterday? It flew south, toward the Mustang Mountains. There's a family-friendly campground there. If our canyon flooded this badly," she didn't need to finish. Thomas had been so focused on their immediate situation, he hadn't considered the broader impact of the storm. Other canyons, other trails, potentially other people caught unprepared. "We should continue," he said, shouldering their tools. But Sarah's words stayed with him as they worked through the afternoon, clearing debris and stabilizing sections of the new route. By sunset, they had completed nearly half the trail. Exhausted but satisfied, they marked their progress with a final cairn, larger than the others, with a distinctive white quartz stone on top. "For good luck," Sarah explained, placing the stone carefully. "And so we don't lose our way tomorrow." Back at the cave, they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and piñon nuts. The silence between them had transformed from wary to comfortable, then to something approaching companionable. Thomas found himself observing Sarah as she might observe the wildlife she photographed. Noting patterns, expressions, the way firelight caught in her eyes when she spoke of things that mattered. "I've been thinking," she said, setting aside her empty bowl. "People in Willow Springs probably believe I died in the flood." Thomas nodded. "Likely. Your car would have been found by now. Which means when I walk into town, it will cause quite a stir." She looked at him directly. "They'll ask questions about how I survived, where I've been. You're concerned about revealing my location. I'm concerned about your privacy. You've made it clear you don't want to be found." Thomas considered this. For 15 years, he had maintained his isolation through careful obscurity. The locals knew someone lived in the high canyons, but few had ever seen him, and none knew exactly where. "Tell them what you need to," he said finally. "I won't be here much longer anyway." Sarah tilted her head. "You're leaving the cave?" "Eventually. This place has served its purpose." The decision had been forming in his mind for days, perhaps longer. 15 years is enough penance. Is that what this has been? Penance? Thomas met her gaze steadily. At first, then refuge. Now, he gestured vaguely at the cave walls. Now it's just a cave. Sarah was silent for a long moment. "Where will you go?" "I haven't decided." The truth was, until Sarah's arrival, he hadn't considered leaving at all. Something had shifted, like the canyon floor after the flood, revealing new possibilities beneath the familiar surface. "Well," she said lightly, "don't make any decisions until we finish our trail. I'd hate to do all that rock moving for nothing." Thomas found himself almost smiling again, the second time in years. The sensation was foreign but not unwelcome. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They returned to their trail building with renewed purpose, working from opposite ends to meet in the middle. Thomas cleared obstacles from below while Sarah improved the upper sections, each advancing steadily toward the other. When they finally met at midpoint, Sarah held out her hand. In it lay another white quartz stone. "For the center cairn," she explained. "The joining point." Together they built the marker, larger and more distinctive than the others. When finished, Thomas stepped back to survey their work. The new trail was rougher than the original but serviceable, a testament to human adaptability in the face of nature's reshaping. "It will hold," he pronounced. Sarah nodded, satisfied. "Good teamwork." As they stood side by side, looking down the path they had created together, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, connection to something beyond survival. This trail was more than a means of descent. It was a way forward, for both of them. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll test it all the way to the bottom. Together?" Sarah asked, echoing her question from days earlier. Thomas found the answer came easier this time. Together. The new trail proved sound, leading them safely to the canyon floor. Thomas moved with the assured steps of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, while Sarah followed closely, occasionally pausing to absorb the changed landscape through a photographer's eye. "It's strange," she said as they reached the bottom. "The destruction is devastating, but there's something beautiful about it too. Nature reshaping itself." Thomas nodded. "The Apache believe canyons are living entities. They breathe, grow, die, and are reborn. Is that why you chose this place?" Sarah asked. "For its rebirth?" Instead of answering, Thomas gestured for her to follow. "There's something I want to show you." He led her along the canyon floor, past newly formed pools where none had existed before, through passages revealed by the flood's scouring force. They walked in silence for nearly an hour before Thomas stopped at what appeared to be a dead end. A sheer rock face covered in desert varnish, the dark mineral patina of centuries. "Look closer," he instructed. Sarah approached the wall, squinting in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canyon. Gradually, shapes emerged from the dark surface, faint lines etched through the patina, revealing the lighter stone beneath. Images of animals, human figures, spiral patterns, and symbols she didn't recognize. "Petroglyphs?" she breathed, reaching out but stopping short of touching the ancient art. "How old?" "The oldest? Perhaps 1,000 years. Apache, Hohokam, others before them." Thomas indicated different sections of the wall. "Many hands across many generations. The most recent were added by my grandfather." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Your grandfather created these?" Thomas touched a small etching of a thunderbird. "He was a medicine man. He believed in maintaining connections to the ancestors. He brought me here as a boy, showed me how to listen to the canyon." A faint smile crossed his face. "I thought he was just telling stories." I didn't understand until much later. And now you're showing me. Sarah's voice was soft with the significance of the moment. The flood revealed this place again. It was hidden for many years behind brush and fallen rock. Thomas ran his fingers lightly over the ancient markings. The canyon chooses when to share its secrets. Sarah stood silently, absorbing both the artwork and what it meant that Thomas had brought her here. After a week of guarded privacy, this felt like a deliberate opening, an invitation to see beyond the reclusive exterior. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas nodded, then pointed to a series of concentric circles with a line passing through them. The path of life, not a straight journey, but one that circles back on itself, always returning to center. "Is that what you've been doing in your cave? Returning to center?" Perhaps. He studied the ancient symbols. Or perhaps hiding from the path altogether. Sarah moved closer to examine a hunting scene, antelope figures pursued by human forms with bows. These stories have survived floods, droughts, wars. They endure. People are less durable, Thomas said quietly, but more adaptable. Sarah turned to face him. "We rebuild, create new trails when old ones wash away." Their eyes met, understanding passing between them. In the distance, the faint sound of a helicopter broke the canyon silence. "Search and rescue," Thomas observed, glancing skyward. "Still looking. For survivors or bodies?" Sarah asked. "Both, most likely." They watched the helicopter pass overhead without slowing, continuing toward the southern ranges. Sarah's expression grew troubled. "I should let them know I'm alive. My emergency contact will be worried by now." She hesitated. "But I'm not ready to leave yet." Thomas studied her face. "Why?" "Because." She gestured at the petroglyphs, the canyon, then back to Thomas. "This feels important. Being here now. I can't explain it better than that." Thomas understood. The canyon had brought them together for a reason, the storm, the flood, their shared trail building. There was something unfinished between them, something still taking shape. "We should head back," he said finally. "It will be dark soon." As they turned to leave, Sarah stopped to take one last photograph with her mind. The ancient wall with its stories, Thomas standing beside it, the connection between past and present made visible. On their return journey, they spotted fresh boot prints in the mud near the canyon entrance. Someone had been there since the flood. Thomas crouched to examine them. Rangers, probably, assessing damage. His expression darkened. "Or looking for you. Should we be concerned?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but we should be cautious." Thomas straightened, scanning the canyon walls. The outside world is getting closer. They climbed their new trail in thoughtful silence, each considering what it would mean when their temporary refuge ended. At the cave entrance, Thomas paused, turning to survey the vast landscape spread before them, the transformed canyon catching the golden light of late afternoon. "I've been thinking about what you said," he offered unexpectedly. "About rebirth. That's not why I came here. I came to disappear." "And now?" Sarah asked. Thomas touched the medicine pouch at his neck, a gesture Sarah had noticed he made when weighing important matters. "Now I'm not so sure. The canyon keeps changing. Perhaps we should too." It wasn't quite an answer, but Sarah accepted it with a nod. Some paths revealed themselves only as you walked them. Inside the cave, preparing their evening meal, they moved in the easy rhythm they had developed over the past week. Thomas tending the fire, Sarah preparing the food, few words needed between them. The shared experience of the petroglyphs had shifted something subtle but significant. That night, Thomas took out his cedar flute for the first time in 15 years and played a simple, haunting melody that filled the cave with echoes of the past made new again. Morning arrived with a sound that didn't belong in the canyon's natural symphony. A child's voice, high and frightened, calling for help. Thomas was awake and moving before the echo faded. Sarah close behind him. "Did you hear that?" she asked, pulling on her boots. Thomas nodded grimly. Eastern Ridge. 1/2 mile, maybe less. They left the cave without discussion, following the faint cries that rose sporadically above the wind. The storm had created treacherous conditions, loose scree, unstable ledges, deceptive footing where solid ground had become undermined by water damage. "Hello," Sarah called out. "Where are you?" "Here," came the response, clearer now. "I'm stuck. Please help." They found him on a narrow ledge 20 feet below the rim. A boy of perhaps 7 or 8, tear-streaked and dusty, clutching a stuffed rabbit to his chest. He had wedged himself into a small crevice, paralyzed by fear as loose stones tumbled into the void below. "Don't move," Thomas instructed, voice calm but carrying authority. He turned to Sarah. "Stay here and keep talking to him. I'll approach from below." "Be careful," she said, then focused on the child. "Hey there. What's your rabbit's name?" "Mr. Hoppy," the boy answered, his voice steadying slightly at the mundane question. "Mr. Hoppy looks very brave. Can you and Mr. Hoppy stay very still for me? My friend is coming to help you." Thomas moved with careful efficiency, finding hand and footholds in the canyon wall that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. Sarah watched, heart in her throat, as he navigated the crumbling surface, testing each grip before committing his weight. "What's your name?" she called down to the boy. "Jamie." He clutched the rabbit tighter. "Are you angels?" Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. "No, Jamie. I'm Sarah and that's Thomas. We live here in the canyon." "Like canyon fairies?" "Something like that." Thomas reached the ledge and positioned himself beside the boy, speaking in low, reassuring tones that Sarah couldn't quite hear. After a moment, he secured Jamie to his back and began the careful ascent. "Good job, Jamie," Sarah encouraged. "Thomas is the best climber in all of Arizona. You're in good hands." When they finally reached solid ground, Jamie launched himself into Sarah's arms, trembling with relief. She held him close, this small stranger who had suddenly materialized in their isolated world. "How did you get all the way out here, Jamie?" she asked gently. "I was with Mommy and Daddy at the picture place." He pointed vaguely toward a popular lookout spot 2 miles distant. "I saw a lizard and followed him. Then I couldn't find the path back, and the ground broke." Thomas scanned the horizon. "Tourist family. They'll be searching." "We should take him to the lookout," Sarah suggested. Thomas shook his head. "Too dangerous with the trail damage. Better to bring him to the cave. Then I'll find the rangers. They'll have established a search perimeter by now." Jamie looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "You have a cave? A real one?" "A real one," Thomas confirmed, his usual stoic expression softening slightly, "with a fire and food and safe places to rest." "Can Mr. Hoppy come too?" "Mr. Hoppy is welcome," Sarah assured him, taking the boy's small hand in hers. "Let's get you somewhere safe." As they walked back to the cave, Jamie's natural resilience emerged. His fear gave way to curiosity as he peppered them with questions. "Do bears live in your cave too? Do you have a TV? Why is your hair so long, mister?" Thomas answered each query with unexpected patience. Sarah watched this interaction with growing wonder. The gruff hermit who had begrudgingly rescued her was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a man who knelt to show a lost child the tracks of a canyon wren in the dust. The cave, Jamie's eyes grew round with amazement. "It's like a house inside a mountain." "Exactly right," Sarah agreed, settling him near the fire. "Are you hungry?" He nodded vigorously, clutching Mr. Hoppy under one arm while accepting dried fruit with the other. Thomas moved to gather his tracking gear, preparing to find the search party. "Will you be okay with him?" he asked Sarah quietly. "We'll be fine," she assured him. "But be careful out there. The rangers might not take kindly to the mad Apache approaching them." Thomas's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I'll be diplomatic." After he left, Sarah entertained Jamie with stories and simple games. The boy's innocent presence filled the cave with a different energy, laughter, movement, the unfiltered questions of childhood. "Are you and Thomas married?" he asked as she helped him clean mud from Mr. Hoppy's ears. "No," Sarah answered, surprised by the question. "We're just friends." Jamie considered this. "My mom says friends are people who help each other and make each other happy. Thomas helped me, and he looks at you like my daddy looks at my mom." Sarah felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Does he now?" "Aha, like you're his favorite person." Before Sarah could formulate a response, a shout echoed from outside. Thomas had returned, and he wasn't alone. A ranger in uniform stood beside him, radio in hand. "Jamie!" the ranger called, relief evident in his voice. "Thank goodness you're safe." The boy ran to the cave entrance, Mr. Hoppy bouncing at his side. "I was on an adventure with the mountain people. They have a real cave and everything." The ranger looked from Thomas to Sarah with obvious confusion. "Ms. Holloway, we've had search teams looking for you for over a week. Everyone thought you were dead. As you can see, I survived," Sarah replied, coming to stand beside Thomas. "Thanks to Thomas." "Thomas Redcloud?" The ranger's hand drifted unconsciously toward his holstered sidearm. "The former tribal officer?" Thomas met the man's gaze steadily. "The same." A tense silence followed, broken by Jamie tugging at the ranger's sleeve. "Thomas is a hero, Officer Mike. He climbed up the scary rocks and saved me and Mr. Hoppy." The ranger's posture relaxed slightly. "Well, thank you for that, and for contacting us." He spoke into his radio, confirming Jamie's safety and requesting transport. Then he turned back to Sarah. "Your rental car was found washed into a ravine. Your emergency contact has been notified of your presumed death." "I'll need to set that right," Sarah said. "Yes, ma'am. We can help with that once we get back to headquarters." The ranger glanced around the cave with poorly disguised curiosity. "Quite a setup you have here, Mr. Redcloud." Thomas didn't respond, his expression unreadable once more. When it was time for Jamie to leave, he hugged both Sarah and Thomas fiercely. "Can I come back and visit your cave sometime?" Sarah knelt to his level. "This is a special place, Jamie. Not many people know about it." "I can keep a secret," he promised, clutching Mr. Hoppy tightly. "Cross my heart." Thomas surprised her by placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "The canyon will remember you, Jamie, and so will we." As the ranger led Jamie away, the boy turned back once more, waving Mr. Hoppy's paw in farewell. The stuffed rabbit, accidentally left behind in the commotion, remained on Sarah's sleeping mat, a small ambassador from the outside world they had both tried to escape. The ranger, Officer Mike Peterson, insisted that Sarah return with him to Willow Springs. "Protocol," he explained. "A missing person found alive require documentation, statements, proper procedures." "I understand," Sarah said, gathering her few belongings. "But I'll need to come back for my equipment." A thin excuse, but necessary. She wasn't ready to leave the canyon or Thomas so abruptly. Thomas stood at the cave entrance, silent and watchful. The easy companionship they had developed over the past 10 days had vanished in the ranger's presence, replaced by the wary distance of their first encounter. "Mr. Redcloud," Officer Peterson addressed him formally, "we'd appreciate a statement from you as well, when you're in town." Thomas nodded once, non-committal. Sarah approached him while the ranger radioed for transport. "I'll return tomorrow if that's all right. We still have unfinished business." She meant more than her abandoned camera and journal, and they both knew it. "The cave will be here," Thomas replied, his expression giving nothing away. Their journey to the canyon floor was tense. The ranger peppered Sarah with questions about her survival while casting suspicious glances at Thomas. Word of the mad Apache had clearly reached official channels. A rescue vehicle waited at the canyon entrance, a modified jeep with emergency equipment and communications gear. A small crowd had gathered, other rangers, local volunteers who had joined the search, and a reporter from the Willow Springs Gazette. "Sarah Holloway?" The reporter pushed forward, notebook in hand. "Is it true you've been living with the hermit of Dragoon Canyon? How did you survive the flood? Was he holding you against your will?" "That's enough, Jenkins," Officer Peterson intervened. "Ms. Holloway needs medical attention and debriefing." "I'm perfectly fine," Sarah protested, but found herself guided firmly toward the jeep. Thomas remained at the periphery, ignored by most, watched warily by others. Only Jamie, reunited with his parents nearby, waved enthusiastically. "Thomas, Sarah, look, Mommy. Those are the mountain people who saved me." Jamie's mother approached, tears in her eyes. "I can't thank you enough." When we realized Jamie was missing, she embraced Sarah, then turned to Thomas with momentary hesitation before offering her hand. "You saved our boy. We're eternally grateful." Thomas accepted her handshake with dignity. "He's a brave child. You should be proud." The simple exchange drew attention. The reporter edged closer. "Thomas Redcloud, right? The former tribal police officer who disappeared after the reservation school massacre? Care to comment on where you've been all these years?" Thomas's expression hardened. Sarah stepped between them. "Mr. Redcloud rescued not only Jamie but me as well. Without him, we'd both be dead." "That's your story," the reporter scribbled frantically. "And your relationship with Mr. Redcloud is?" "None of your business," she said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us." But the reporter persisted, following as Sarah was escorted to the jeep. "The people have questions, Ms. Holloway. A wildlife photographer presumed dead found living with a reclusive Native American with a mysterious past? That's front-page material." "Write what you want," Sarah replied. "Just get your facts straight." As she was about to enter the vehicle, she turned back toward Thomas, but he had vanished, melted away into the landscape as only someone who truly belonged to it could do. The ride to Willow Springs passed in a blur of unwanted attention. By the time they reached the ranger station, news of her miraculous survival had spread throughout the small town. People lined the main street, pointing and whispering as the jeep passed. Inside the station, Sarah provided her statement, a carefully edited version that protected Thomas's privacy while emphasizing his heroism. Yes, he had rescued her from the flood. Yes, he had tended her injuries. No, she never felt threatened. No, she wasn't aware of any illegal activities. "He's lived up there peacefully for 15 years, she pointed out, harming no one, asking nothing from anyone. Why the third degree?" Officer Peterson shuffled uncomfortably. "It's not that simple, Ms. Holloway. Mr. Redcloud left under complicated circumstances. The school shooting. I know about that. Not just the shooting." The ranger lowered his voice. "The third suspect in that case was never found. Some believe Redcloud found him first and took justice into his own hands." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. Thomas had alluded to something similar during their fireside conversation. "Those are just rumors." "Maybe, but Sheriff Dixon has questions that were never answered." After completing the paperwork, Sarah was finally released. The town's small medical clinic confirmed her ankle was healing properly, and the hotel offered a complimentary room, part hospitality, part curiosity about their suddenly famous guest. That evening, the Willow Springs Gazette published a special edition. The headline blazed across the front page, "Miracle in the Mountains. Photographer and child rescued by mysterious canyon hermit." The article painted Thomas as a tragic figure, the grieving husband and father who had retreated from civilization, only to emerge as an unlikely hero. Most details were speculative, but the tone was sympathetic, largely due to Jamie's parents' effusive praise. Sarah read the piece in her hotel room, torn between relief at the positive portrayal and concern about the unwanted attention it would bring to Thomas's sanctuary. The final paragraph troubled her most. Sheriff Robert Dixon notes that while Redcloud's actions were commendable, questions remain about his activities since disappearing 15 years ago. "We'll be paying him a visit," Dixon stated. "There are some unresolved matters from the past that need addressing." Sarah folded the newspaper and stared out the window toward the distant mountains. Thomas was up there, alone again after days of her company. Had her presence in his life brought only disruption, or something more valuable? The stuffed rabbit that Jamie had left behind sat on her hotel bed, a small, silent reminder of connections formed and promises made. Tomorrow she would return to the canyon, as she told Thomas she would. What she couldn't predict was what, or who, she would find when she got there. Dawn found Sarah already on the trail, Jamie's stuffed rabbit tucked into her backpack alongside provisions she'd purchased in town. The shopkeeper had refused payment. "For our miracle survivor," he'd insisted. But his probing questions about Thomas had left her uneasy. The canyon looked different in morning light, more inviting than threatening. Sarah followed their newly constructed path with growing anticipation. Would Thomas welcome her return, or had their brief connection already begun to fade in her absence? She found her answer halfway up the trail. A notice had been nailed to a juniper tree, official letterhead, plastic covered against the elements. Notice of trespass. All persons found in Dragoon Canyon north of Marker 16 are subject to arrest and prosecution for trespassing on federal lands temporarily closed due to hazardous conditions following recent flooding. By order of Sheriff R. Dixon, Cochise County. Sarah stared at the notice, anger rising in her chest. This wasn't about public safety, it was about isolating Thomas, cutting him off. Dixon was making his move already. She continued upward with renewed determination. Near the cave entrance, she called out rather than entering unannounced. "Thomas? It's Sarah." No answer came. The cave stood silent, the fire pit cold. Sarah moved inside cautiously, noting subtle differences. Some supplies missing, sleeping areas cleared. Her heart sank. Had he already gone? A sound behind her made her turn sharply. Thomas stood in the entrance, watching her with unreadable eyes. "You came back," he said simply. Relief flooded through her. "I said I would." Thomas nodded once, then moved past her to deposit freshly gathered herbs on a stone ledge. His movements were efficient but tense, his earlier openness replaced by guarded caution. "I saw the notice on the trail," Sarah said. "Dixon isn't wasting any time." "No." Thomas arranged the herbs methodically. 3 rangers came before dawn, posted notices, took photographs. They didn't approach the cave. "Yet," Sarah added grimly. Thomas turned to face her. "You shouldn't have returned. The situation is complicated. Because of the third suspect, the one who was never found." At his sharp look, she added, "Officer Peterson mentioned rumors. I didn't press for details." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Some stories are better left untold." "Not if they're about to get you arrested," Sarah countered. "Dixon clearly has something in mind. I need to know what we're facing." "We?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "This isn't your fight, Sarah. It became my fight when I testified against corporate interests poisoning native land. It became my fight when you pulled me from that flood." She stepped closer. "It became my fight when you showed me the petroglyphs and played your grandfather's flute." Something in Thomas's expression softened, though his posture remained wary. "The past doesn't disappear just because we walk away from it. I learned that lesson too late." "Then tell me. All of it." Sarah reached into her pack and withdrew Jamie's stuffed rabbit. "He left this behind. I promised I'd return it when we visit him in town." Thomas took the small toy, a faint smile touching his lips. "Brave little warrior. Like someone else I know." Sarah sat by the cold fire pit. "Talk to me, Thomas." Please. He remained standing, the rabbit in his weathered hands a strange contrast to his imposing presence. Finally, he spoke. After the school shooting, I led the investigation. We caught 2 suspects quickly, Timothy Burke and Wayne Mathers, both members of a white nationalist group. His voice remained steady, detached, as if recounting someone else's story. But the third man escaped, James Riley, the one who actually entered my wife's classroom. Sarah watched his face, seeing the control it took to speak these names aloud. The investigation stalled. Evidence disappeared from the county lockup. Witnesses changed their statements. Thomas's hands tightened on the stuffed rabbit. I discovered Sheriff Dixon had connections to the same group. Not a member, but sympathetic. He was deliberately obstructing justice. Did you report him? To whom? He was the highest law enforcement officer in the county. Thomas set the rabbit down carefully. I tracked Riley myself. Found him hiding at a compound near the Mexican border. I confronted him. Thomas fell silent, the memory clearly painful. Did you kill him? Sarah asked quietly. No. Thomas met her eyes directly. I wanted to, had every intention of doing so. But when I faced him, this pathetic, frightened man, I realized it wouldn't bring Anna and Michael back. Nothing would. So what happened? We fought. He fell or jumped into a ravine. I searched but never found his body. Thomas's expression darkened. Dixon arrived with his deputies minutes later, as if he'd known exactly where to find us. He accused me of murder, said he had witnesses who would testify I pushed Riley. But there was no body, Sarah pointed out. Doesn't matter in the court of public opinion. I was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The tribal council was pressured to disavow me. Thomas's voice held old bitterness. Rather than drag my people through more pain, I disappeared. Let them all think what they wanted. Sarah absorbed this, connecting pieces of the puzzle. And now Dixon is sheriff again. Never stopped being sheriff. Thomas gestured toward the cave entrance. He's wanted to drive me out for years. Now he has public interest on his side. Because of me, Sarah realized. My rescue put you back in the spotlight. Not your fault. Thomas gathered kindling, rebuilding the fire with practiced movements. This confrontation was always coming. Dixon has other interests in these canyons beyond old grudges. What interests? Before Thomas could answer, a shout echoed from below. Someone was climbing their trail. Multiple someones, judging by the voices. Thomas moved to the entrance, body tense. Rangers, 4 of them, and Dixon. Sarah joined him, watching the approaching figures in their official uniforms. What do we do? Thomas's face settled into grim determination. We listen to what they have to say. Then I decide whether to leave peacefully or not. The unspoken alternative hung in the air between them as they waited for the approaching confrontation. Sheriff Robert Dixon cut an imposing figure despite his 60-plus years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent scowl etched into it. He approached the cave with practiced authority, 4 rangers trailing behind him like reluctant honor guards. Thomas Redcloud, Dixon called, stopping several yards from the entrance. Been a long time. Thomas stood motionless in the shadow of the cave opening. Not long enough, Dixon. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Sarah. Ms. Holloway, surprised to find you back up here so soon. Thought you'd have had enough of playing Jane to this Tarzan. I came to return something to Thomas, Sarah replied evenly. What brings the sheriff himself up a dangerous trail he just declared off-limits? Dixon smiled without warmth. Official business. This canyon has been temporarily closed pending environmental assessment following the flood damage. He held up a document. I have the authority to remove any unauthorized persons. This is Apache land, Thomas stated. Has been for centuries. Actually, Dixon countered. According to county records, this particular section falls under federal management, not reservation land. He stepped forward, offering the paper. See for yourself. Thomas made no move to take it. Sarah did instead, scanning the document with growing concern. It appeared legitimate, complete with survey coordinates and official seals. This is dated last week, she noted. Conveniently recent. The flood necessitated reassessment of boundaries, Dixon explained smoothly. Safety concerns. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with Horizon Mining's interest in these canyons, Thomas said. Dixon's expression flickered briefly before settling back into professional neutrality. I'm not here to debate land rights, Redcloud. I'm here to enforce a legal order. You have 24 hours to vacate. After that, we'll remove you and your belongings. Under whose authority? Sarah demanded. County Emergency Management, backed by federal agencies. Dixon's gaze hardened. And while we're at it, there's still an open investigation into James Riley's disappearance. Might be time to revisit that file. Thomas stepped forward, and the Rangers tensed visibly. After 15 years? Must be election season. Justice has no expiration date, Dixon replied, especially for a man who took it into his own hands. Sarah moved to Thomas's side. If you're making accusations, Sheriff, do it properly with evidence and due process. Otherwise, it sounds like harassment. Dixon studied her with new interest. You're awfully defensive of a man you've known for, 2 weeks? Makes a person wonder what went on up here all that time. He saved my life, Sarah said flatly, and a child's life yesterday. What have you done lately besides post threatening notices? A tense silence followed, broken only by the canyon wind. Finally, Dixon stepped back. 24 hours, Redcloud. Then we do this the hard way. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Ms. Holloway? You might want to consider your own legal position. Aiding a person of interest in an open investigation could be construed as obstruction. After they departed, Sarah unfolded the document again. This can't be right. There must be earlier records. There are, Thomas confirmed. My grandfather showed me the original boundaries. This canyon was acknowledged as traditional Apache territory in the 1934 agreements. Then we need those records. Sarah's mind was already working through possibilities. County archives would have the original surveys and treaties. Thomas shook his head. Even if such documents exist, they'll be buried or lost. Dixon has had 15 years to cover his tracks. Maybe, but I doubt he expected someone with legal research experience to get involved. Sarah tucked the paper into her pocket. I handled land rights disputes for 3 environmental cases. I know how to find buried documents. Thomas watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. This isn't your fight, Sarah. You keep saying that. She met his gaze steadily. When will you accept that I've chosen to make it mine? Something shifted in Thomas's expression. A softening around the eyes, a tension releasing in his shoulders. You should know what you're really facing. This isn't just about me or old boundaries. He moved to the back of the cave, to the carved wooden chest he rarely opened. From it, he withdrew a rolled parchment yellowed with age. My grandfather's, he explained, carefully unrolling it on a flat stone. A hand-drawn map from the 1920s, showing mineral deposits throughout the Dragoon Range. Sarah leaned closer, examining the faded markings. Gold, copper, some silver. But here, Thomas pointed to notations in the upper canyon near their location. Uranium, low-grade, but substantial. Not worth mining in my grandfather's time, but valuable now with renewed interest in nuclear energy, Sarah finished, understanding dawning. Dixon isn't just harassing you out of old grudges. Horizon Mining made 4 exploratory trips into these canyons last year. Their geologists took samples less than a mile from here. Thomas carefully re-rolled the map. Dixon's brother-in-law sits on their board of directors. Sarah paced the cave, mind racing. We need proof, the original land documents, evidence of Dixon's connection to Horizon. Anything that shows this reclassification is fraudulent. The county records are public in theory, Thomas said. But Dixon has allies everywhere. You won't get access easily, especially as the woman staying with the dangerous hermit. Sarah smiled suddenly. Then I won't go as myself. She pulled out her cell phone, useless for calls in the canyon, but still containing photos. She showed Thomas an image. Sarah in professional attire, hair styled differently, glasses perched on her nose. Meet Sarah Holloway, environmental law consultant. Before I became a full-time photographer, this was my daily look. Thomas studied the image, then looked back at the determined woman before him. You'd risk your freedom for a land dispute that isn't yours? For justice that's 15 years overdue? Sarah put away the phone. Absolutely. Thomas was silent for a long moment. We'll need transportation, disguises, a plan for accessing records without raising alarms. Sarah raised an eyebrow. If you're foolish enough to fight my battles, Thomas said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, the least I can do is watch your back. By dusk, they had formed a plan, risky, possibly illegal, but their only chance against Dixon's 24-hour deadline. They would travel to the county seat under cover of darkness. Sarah disguised as her former professional self. Thomas transformed enough to move through town unrecognized. Their goal: find the original deed to the canyon lands, proving the Apache claim predated any mining interests or federal reclassification. As night fell, Thomas secured the cave, not as a man preparing to abandon his home, but as one determined to defend it. The old land deed, carefully preserved in its protective covering, rested in Sarah's backpack, a fragile weapon in a battle that had begun long before either of them entered the canyon. The Cochise County Records Office occupied the basement of an aging administration building, a labyrinth of filing cabinets, microfilm readers, and dust-covered ledgers that hadn't been fully digitized despite the modern age. Perfect for their purposes. Sarah entered alone, dressed in a borrowed business suit from the town's small thrift store, hair pulled back severely, glasses perched on her nose. Thomas waited in the library across the street, nearly unrecognizable with his hair cut short and wearing contemporary clothes for the first time in 15 years. Good morning, Sarah greeted the elderly clerk, channeling her former professional persona. I'm researching historical land boundaries for an environmental impact assessment. I need access to the original Apache territory agreements from the 1930s, specifically regarding the Dragoon Mountain range. The clerk blinked owlishly behind thick glasses. That's quite specific. Any particular reason? Watershed protection analysis, Sarah replied smoothly, placing a business card on the counter. Hastily created at the town's print shop that morning. My firm is conducting a multi-year study of indigenous land management practices and their impact on water conservation. Whether impressed by the technical jargon or simply uninterested in questioning further, the clerk directed Sarah to the appropriate section. Cabinet 32, drawers C through F, sign the access log, please. For 3 hours, Sarah methodically worked through faded maps, boundary surveys, and legal documents. The records were disorganized, some deliberately misfiled, but her experience in environmental law cases served her well. By mid-afternoon, she had assembled a compelling paper trail, the original 1934 agreement recognizing the canyon as ancestral Apache land, subsequent mineral surveys noting uranium deposits, and most critically, a 1992 reaffirmation of the boundary signed by the then-governor. Nowhere did she find legal documentation supporting Dixon's claim that the canyon had been reclassified as federal land. Only a penciled notation on a recent map indicating pending status review. Sarah carefully photographed each relevant document with her phone, then returned everything to its original location. As she prepared to leave, a new voice stopped her cold. Finding everything you need, Miss Holloway? Sheriff Dixon stood blocking the exit, arms crossed over his chest. Sarah maintained her composure. Sheriff, what a coincidence. Yes, the clerk has been most helpful with my research. Research? Dixon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Interesting how your environmental study focuses on the exact canyon where your rescuer has been squatting illegally. I go where the data leads, Sarah replied evenly. And speaking of data, I'm curious about the legal basis for your reclassification notice. I haven't found the authorizing documentation. Dixon stepped closer. County emergency management doesn't require prior documentation for temporary safety closures. Temporary, yes, but you're citing permanent boundary changes that don't appear in any official record I can find. Perhaps you're not looking in the right places. Dixon's voice hardened. Or perhaps you should ask yourself why you're risking your reputation for a man with blood on his hands. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. From what I've learned about the school shooting investigation, Sheriff, there are questions about whose hands are truly stained. A dangerous flash crossed Dixon's face. Be careful, Ms. Holloway. Reputations are fragile things. So are careers. And sometimes, lives. Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and Thomas entered. His transformation effective enough that Dixon didn't immediately recognize him. Sarah, Thomas said casually, we'll be late for our meeting if we don't leave now. Dixon turned, suspicious but uncertain. Thomas kept his face averted. Just another anonymous researcher. Of course. Sarah gathered her notes. Thank you for your assistance, Sheriff Dixon. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon. Outside, they walked unhurriedly until turning a corner, then quickened their pace toward the truck Thomas had borrowed from an old reservation acquaintance. Did you find it? Thomas asked once they were safely moving toward the canyon. Everything we need, Sarah confirmed, showing him the photos on her phone. The canyon was never legally reclassified. Dixon's notice is based on nothing but his own authority and fabricated emergency powers. Thomas's expression remained grim. Dixon won't back down because of some old papers. No, but the tribal council might fight for their land with this evidence. And a judge could issue an injunction against any mining activity. Sarah hesitated. There's something else. I found permits filed by Horizon Mining for exploratory drilling, dated 3 months ago before the flood. They've been planning this move for some time. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. Dixon saw an opportunity in the disaster. Perfect cover to force me out and clear the way for Horizon. As they approached the canyon, Thomas slowed the truck, taking a circuitous route to avoid being spotted. They abandoned the vehicle in a hidden arroyo and continued on foot, alert for patrols. The sun was setting when they reached the cave, casting long shadows across the canyon. Inside, Thomas immediately sensed something was wrong. Items had been moved, supplies disturbed. They've been here, he said quietly, checking his few personal possessions. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the violation of his sanctuary was evident in subtle disarray. Sarah surveyed the damage with growing anger. Dixon's not waiting for his deadline. No, Thomas agreed. He's sending a message. From his wooden chest, Thomas removed a small silver locket on a leather cord. He held it for a moment, lost in private memory, then turned to Sarah. This belonged to my wife, he said simply. It's the last thing I have of hers. Sarah started to protest, but Thomas gently placed the locket in her hand, closing her fingers around it. Keep it safe, he continued. Whatever happens tomorrow, Dixon and his men will return in force. If things go badly, I want something of mine to survive. The weight of the locket felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's palm. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was trust, memory, vulnerability from a man who had walled himself away from the world for 15 years. Nothing is going to happen to you, she insisted. We have evidence now. We can fight this legally. Thomas smiled faintly. The law hasn't always been kind to my people, Sarah. As darkness settled over the canyon, they prepared for whatever morning would bring. Thomas moved with the calm precision of a man who had faced battles before, gathering only essentials, securing what couldn't be carried. Sarah watched him, realizing how completely her life had changed in less than 2 weeks. She had come to these mountains seeking solitude and natural beauty for her photography. Instead, she had found purpose, injustice to fight, and a man whose quiet strength had awakened something she thought long buried. The silver locket hung around her neck now, a tangible reminder of choices made and sides chosen. Tomorrow they would confront Dixon with the truth, armed with documents, determination, and the unspoken connection that had grown between them. Stronger than either had anticipated, dawn arrived with ominous clouds gathering over the Dragoon Mountains, mirroring the tension in the cave. Thomas had risen before first light, preparing for the confrontation to come. Sarah found him outside on a small ledge, applying red ochre to his face in traditional Apache patterns. "War paint?" she asked, joining him in the gray morning light. "Protection," Thomas corrected, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "My grandfather taught me these markings. They aren't about fighting. They're about standing your ground with strength and clarity." Sarah watched as he drew 2 red lines down his cheeks, then a horizontal band across his forehead. The transformation was subtle but profound. Thomas Redcloud, the recluse, becoming something older, more connected to the ancestors whose blood ran in his veins. "I contacted Jamie's parents last night," Sarah said, showing him her phone. "They've agreed to speak publicly about your rescue of their son. It won't stop Dixon, but it might sway public opinion." Thomas nodded, adding a final mark over his heart. "Every ally helps. I've sent word to the reservation as well. Joseph Blackhawk was my partner on the tribal police. He's now on the council. Will they come? Perhaps. The relationship is complicated." Thomas set aside the small stone bowl of pigment. "Many believed I dishonored the badge when I disappeared. Others understood but couldn't openly support me. And now we'll see what 15 years has changed." Thomas stood, surveying the canyon stretching below them. "Dixon won't come alone. He'll bring enough force to make his point. We have the law on our side," Sarah reminded him, touching the documents secured in her backpack. "And the truth." Thomas's expression remained solemn. "In my experience, those aren't always enough." They spent the morning in preparations that felt both practical and symbolic. Thomas secured the most sacred items in his wooden chest and moved it deeper into the cave system, to a hidden chamber. Sarah organized their evidence and drafted a formal complaint to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, ready to submit electronically once they had cell service. "If Dixon tries to forcibly remove you, I'll record everything," she said, checking the battery on her repaired camera. "Public exposure is something he clearly fears." "Be careful," Thomas warned. "Dixon isn't above creating his own narrative. If something happens to me—" "Nothing will happen to you," Sarah interrupted firmly. Thomas continued as if she hadn't spoken. "If something happens, take the evidence straight to Joseph Blackhawk on the reservation. No one else. The county officials can't be trusted." Sarah wanted to argue but recognized the wisdom in having a contingency plan. She nodded reluctantly. "Agreed. But it won't come to that." By mid-morning, they heard the first vehicles approaching, the distinctive rumble of heavy-duty trucks navigating the rough terrain below. Thomas moved to the cave entrance, Sarah beside him, as a caravan came into view, 2 sheriff's department SUVs, a ranger vehicle, and behind them, an unmarked black pickup that Thomas identified immediately. "Horizon Mining," he said grimly. "Dixon isn't even pretending anymore." Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "Let me do the talking at first. Legal challenges before confrontation." The vehicles parked at the canyon floor, and 6 men ascended the trail, Sheriff Dixon leading, flanked by 2 deputies, followed by a ranger and two men in corporate attire carrying what looked like survey equipment. Thomas stood tall at the cave entrance, the ochre markings stark against his weathered skin. Sarah remained slightly behind him, camera ready but not yet raised. "Time's up, Redcloud," Dixon called as the group approached. "I've got a removal order and the manpower to enforce it." "You have a fraudulent notice based on non-existent authority," Sarah countered, stepping forward. "We've verified the original land boundaries. This canyon remains recognized Apache territory under the 1934 agreement and the 1992 reaffirmation." Dixon's expression darkened. "This is a county matter, Ms. Holloway. Your amateur legal opinions aren't relevant." "Perhaps these will be," Sarah replied, holding up her phone displaying the photographed documents, along with the improperly filed permits for Horizon Mining's exploratory work. "Interesting timing. Filing for uranium extraction rights just before a convenient flood creates your excuse to clear the area." The men in corporate attire exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered something to Dixon, who waved him off impatiently. "Ms. Holloway," Dixon said with forced patience, "I suggest you step aside. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does." Sarah raised her camera, beginning to record. "As both a witness to your harassment of Mr. Redcloud and a journalist documenting what appears to be corruption and illegal seizure of protected tribal lands." "Turn that off," Dixon ordered, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "I wouldn't," came a new voice from farther up the canyon wall. All heads turned to see Joseph Blackhawk standing on a higher ledge, accompanied by three other men from the reservation. They had approached silently from the back trails that only locals knew existed. "Joseph," Thomas acknowledged with a slight nod. "Thomas." Blackhawk returned the nod, then focused on Dixon. "Sheriff, the Tribal Council has been notified of your activities here. We filed an emergency injunction with the federal court regarding any attempts to remove residents or alter the landscape of this canyon." Dixon's face flushed with anger. "This is outside your jurisdiction, Blackhawk." "Actually, it's precisely within our jurisdiction, as Ms. Holloway has apparently discovered." Blackhawk descended to join them, a tablet in hand. "We've been gathering our own evidence regarding Horizon Mining's interest in these lands. Their permits were filed without the legally required tribal consultation." The standoff intensified, neither side willing to back down. Thomas remained utterly still, a solid presence around which the conflict swirled. Sarah continued recording, documenting every word and gesture. One of the Horizon representatives stepped forward. "Sheriff, perhaps we should postpone today's survey until the legal questions are clarified." "There are no legal questions," Dixon snapped. "This is a safety matter under county jurisdiction." "Is that why you brought mining surveyors to a safety inspection?" Sarah asked innocently, making sure her camera captured the equipment they carried. Dixon's control visibly slipped. "Enough. Redcloud, you're coming with us now, one way or another." "Deputies." "I wouldn't finish that order," Blackhawk interrupted, "unless you want to explain to a federal judge why you violated sovereign tribal territory against explicit legal notice." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air like the storm clouds gathering overhead. Thomas hadn't moved or spoken, his stillness somehow more powerful than any threat could have been. Finally, Dixon stepped back. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." He glared at Thomas. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Redcloud. Some debts don't expire with time." As the sheriff and his men retreated down the trail, Sarah lowered her camera, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation had been averted, but the underlying threat remained. Thomas turned to Blackhawk, extending his hand in the traditional Apache greeting. "Thank you, brother." 15 years is a long silence between friends, Blackhawk replied, accepting the gesture. "But some bonds don't break with time." The storm that had been gathering broke at last, releasing its rain upon the canyon. washing away Thomas's ochre markings, but not the determination they represented. Joseph Blackhawk and his companions didn't linger after Dixon's departure. There were tribal council meetings to attend, legal proceedings to initiate, a community to inform. Before leaving, Blackhawk pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation while Sarah organized the evidence they had gathered. "The council wants you to come back, Thomas," Blackhawk said. "Your knowledge of the old boundaries and traditions could help protect more than just this canyon." Thomas glanced toward Sarah, then back to his old friend. "I've been away a long time." "Too long," Blackhawk agreed. "But not so long that you've been forgotten. Your father's sister asks about you still. The elders remember your grandfather's wisdom in you." For the first time in years, Thomas felt the pull of community, of belonging somewhere beyond his isolated sanctuary. He made no promises but nodded his acknowledgement. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "after this matter is settled." As Blackhawk and his men departed, the rain intensified, driving Thomas and Sarah deeper into the cave. The atmosphere between them had shifted, a new tension born not of conflict but of possibility. The confrontation with Dixon had changed something fundamental, forcing both to consider futures beyond their temporary alliance. "That was impressive legal maneuvering," Thomas observed, building up the fire against the cave's growing dampness. "You knew exactly which regulations to cite." Sarah arranged their damp outer clothing near the flames. "I've had some practice with land disputes. More than a wildlife photographer would typically need," Thomas noted, watching her with quiet intensity. "Your knowledge is specific." Sarah stilled, then sighed. "You're right. I haven't been entirely honest with you, Thomas." She reached into her backpack and withdrew a leather folder. From it, she removed a business card and several newspaper clippings, handing them to Thomas without comment. The card read, "Sarah Holloway, J.D., Environmental Law Specialist, Indigenous Rights Division, Carter and Weiss, Washington, D.C." The newspaper headlines told the rest. "Attorney takes on mining giants in landmark tribal case. Holloway's evidence leads to federal indictments. Death threats follow tribal water rights victory." Thomas studied the materials, expression unreadable. "You're not just a photographer." "I was an environmental attorney for 10 years, Sarah admitted, specializing in indigenous land and water rights cases. The photography came later, a cover, a way to document environmental damage while maintaining a lower profile." "After the threats," Sarah nodded. "The North Dakota case I mentioned, it wasn't just water contamination. It was deliberate dumping of toxic waste on reservation land to avoid disposal costs. When I built the case against Westridge Resources, things got ugly. My car accident wasn't the only warning. My office was broken into, files stolen, informants threatened." "So you disappeared," Thomas said quietly. "Like I did. I took a leave of absence, bought camera equipment, studied photography intensively, and reinvented myself as a wildlife photographer focusing on threatened ecosystems." Sarah met his gaze directly. "It wasn't a complete lie. I do take photographs. I just have additional motives." Thomas was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me when you learned about Dixon and Horizon Mining?" "At first, I wasn't sure I could trust you," Sarah admitted. "Later, when I could, I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you'd see me differently. That you'd think I was using you or your situation for another legal crusade." Sarah's voice grew softer. "And maybe I was afraid of admitting to myself that I wasn't really done with that life, just hiding from it, like you in your cave." The parallel hung between them, uncomfortable but undeniable. Both had retreated from worlds that had wounded them, seeking refuge in isolation and purpose in limited engagement. Thomas returned the documents to Sarah, his movements deliberate. "Dixon was right about one thing. You're risking a lot for someone you've known briefly." "Am I?" Sarah challenged. "Or am I finally remembering who I really am? The person who fights for what's right, not just documents the wrongs from a safe distance. Rain drummed against the canyon walls outside, filling the silence between them. Thomas moved to his wooden chest, withdrawing a folded document yellowed with age. He handed it to Sarah without explanation. It was a legal brief, handwritten in flowing script dated 1937. An argument for Apache water rights in the Dragoon Mountain watersheds, citing precedents and treaties. "My grandfather," Thomas explained. "He fought the same battles with different weapons. He couldn't file court motions or cite federal regulations, but he understood that some fights must be fought with words before arrows." Sarah traced the careful handwriting with her fingers. "He was wise, yes, and disappointed when I chose the tribal police badge over traditional ways." Thomas's gaze grew distant. "He told me I couldn't stand with one foot in each world forever. Eventually, I would have to choose. And you chose solitude instead." "I chose survival," Thomas corrected. "The only path I could see at the time." Sarah carefully refolded the legal brief. "And now? Dixon won't stop because of one setback. Horizon Mining has too much invested." "No, they won't stop," Thomas agreed. "Which means we need to decide if we're truly committed to this fight, and to each other." The directness of his statement caught Sarah off guard. The connection between them had grown steadily, but neither had acknowledged its depth until now. "I've made my choice," she said quietly, touching the silver locket still hanging around her neck. "I'm staying. For the canyon, for justice, and for you if you'll have me." Thomas moved closer, his hand covering hers where it rested on the locket. "You have a life to return to, a purpose beyond this canyon." "Maybe this canyon is part of that purpose," Sarah replied. "Maybe you are too." Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cave, something new and fragile had taken root. A shared future neither had imagined possible 2 weeks earlier when floodwaters had brought them together. Dixon returned before dawn, not with legal papers but with force. 6 deputies, for Horizon Mining security personnel, and equipment that suggested they weren't planning to merely serve notices. Thomas had anticipated this, waking Sarah while stars still dominated the sky. "They're coming up the main trail," he said, his voice low and urgent. "At least 10 men." Sarah gathered their evidence and essential supplies quickly, sliding her repaired camera into its case. "Should we try to reach the reservation?" Thomas shook his head. "They'll have the known trails watched. We need to stay and document what they're doing." He reached into the hidden recess behind the sleeping area and withdrew something wrapped in oiled leather. His father's bow, unstrung and preserved for 15 years. "Thomas," Sarah cautioned, "we can't fight armed officers." "Not fighting," he corrected, carefully stringing the bow with practiced movements. "Surviving. The bow is silent. If necessary, I can create distractions without revealing our position." They retreated deeper into the cave system as the first shouts echoed from outside. Thomas had shown Sarah these hidden chambers days earlier, a network of passages largely unknown to outsiders, some connecting to higher points on the canyon walls. From a concealed opening 30 feet above the main cave entrance, they watched Dixon deploy his men with military precision. 2 deputies began cataloging and removing Thomas's possessions, piling them unceremoniously outside. Others established a perimeter, while the Horizon personnel unloaded drilling equipment from one of the vehicles. "They're not even pretending anymore," Sarah whispered, filming the activity below. "That's core sampling equipment. They're starting extraction tests today." Thomas's expression hardened. "Dixon knows the tribal council is gathering evidence. He's trying to establish Horizon's presence before any injunction can be enforced." They observed in grim silence as the deputies systematically dismantled Thomas's 15 years of careful existence. Books, tools, cooking implements, medicine stores, all tossed outside like worthless debris. When one deputy reached for the wooden chest Thomas had deliberately left visible, Sarah felt him tense beside her. That chest belonged to my father, Thomas murmured. And his father before him. The deputy struggled with the locked lid, then called to another who approached with a pry bar. Before they could force it open, Dixon intervened. "Leave it for now," he ordered. "Focus on clearing the perimeter. Redcloud might still be nearby." As if confirming Dixon's suspicion, a stone clattered down the canyon wall some distance away, a deliberate distraction Thomas had arranged using a simple lever system triggered by the rising sun's position. The deputies immediately turned their attention in that direction, hands on their weapons. "Spread out," Dixon commanded. "Check the upper ridges. Anderson, Taylor, secure the cave entrance. No one goes in or out." Sarah continued filming as the deputies fanned out across the canyon. The Horizon team seized the opportunity to begin setting up their drilling equipment, clearly eager to extract samples before potential legal intervention. "We need to get this footage to Joseph," Sarah whispered. "It proves they're starting operations without permits on disputed land." Thomas nodded toward a narrow fissure behind them. "That passage leads to the north face. We can circle around and reach the old tribal paths." They retreated silently, navigating the dark passages with only Thomas's intimate knowledge as guidance. Sarah followed close behind him, one hand always maintaining contact with either the rocky wall or Thomas himself. They had nearly reached the northern exit when voices echoed ahead, deputies approaching from the upper canyon. Thomas pulled Sarah into a side chamber just as flashlight beams swept the main passage. "Nothing here," a voice called. "Just another dead end." "Dixon wants every inch checked," another replied. "The old Apache knows these caves better than anyone." They waited, barely breathing, until the deputies moved on. Thomas led them through an even narrower passage, requiring them to turn sideways at points where the walls nearly met. "Almost there," he whispered as light appeared ahead. A sliver of daylight marking an exit concealed by brush and natural rock formations. They emerged on a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon's north face, hidden from view of the main activity below. Thomas immediately nocked an arrow, not aiming but ready. Sarah activated her camera again, documenting the scene from this new vantage point. The drilling had begun, the mechanical whine echoing through the canyon as the bit bored into ancient stone. "Look," she said quietly, pointing to the eastern ridge. A line of vehicles was approaching, tribal police trucks flying the Apache Nation flag. "Joseph," Thomas confirmed, "with official tribal representatives." Below, Dixon noticed the approaching vehicles and barked orders to his men. The deputies regrouped while the Horizon team worked faster, determined to extract their samples before interference arrived. "We need to reach Joseph before Dixon can control the narrative," Sarah said, calculating the safest path down. Thomas studied the approaching tribal vehicles, then the positions of Dixon's men. "There," he indicated a route that would keep them concealed behind rock formations. "But will be exposed for the final 100 yards. "I'll create a distraction," Sarah decided, removing the memory card from her camera and securing it in her pocket. "If I approach openly from this direction, all attention will focus on me." "Too dangerous," Thomas objected. "Dixon is desperate now." "Exactly why I'll be safe," Sarah countered. "He won't risk harming me in front of witnesses, especially with tribal police arriving." She squeezed his arm. "Trust me, I faced down corporate security and private militias. I know how to handle myself." Thomas recognized the determination in her eyes, the same strength that had helped her survive the flood, the injured ankle, the revelations about Dixon's corruption. He nodded once, reluctantly. "I'll circle behind, reach Joseph from the eastern approach," he said. "Be careful, Sarah." Their eyes held for a moment, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. Then Sarah leaned forward, pressing her lips briefly against his. Their first kiss, claimed in a moment of danger rather than safety. "For luck," she said softly, then began making her way down toward the confrontation below, carrying the evidence that might finally bring justice to the canyon that had sheltered them both. Thomas watched her go, bow in hand, heart no longer protected by the walls he had built around it for 15 long years. Sarah emerged from behind a boulder, hands raised to show she carried no weapon, only her camera, recording everything. The reaction was immediate. Deputies spun toward her, hands moving to holsters. Dixon's face registered first surprise, then calculation. "Ms. Holloway," he called, gesturing for his men to stand down. "I'm afraid you're interfering with a county operation." "I'm documenting an illegal mining operation on Apache land," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. She continued walking steadily forward, camera pointed deliberately at the drilling equipment. "Horizon Mining has no permits for extraction on disputed territory, especially while legal proceedings are active." The Horizon supervisor barked something to his men, who moved to block the drilling equipment from Sarah's camera. Too late. She had already captured clear footage of the core sampling in progress. "This is a simple security sweep," Dixon countered, approaching Sarah with forced cordiality. "The mining surveys are merely preliminary assessments, fully authorized by county emergency management." "Is that why you're removing Mr. Redcloud's personal property?" Sarah asked, panning her camera to the pile of possessions outside the cave. "Standard procedure for security sweeps?" Dixon's professional mask slipped momentarily. "Where is Redcloud?" "Safe," Sarah replied, "and gathering additional evidence of your unauthorized activities here." The tribal police vehicles had reached the canyon floor now, dust billowing behind them as they parked in a defensive formation. Joseph Blackhawk emerged from the lead truck, accompanied by 3 tribal officers and an elderly man wearing the formal attire of a tribal council elder. Most significantly, they carried a tribal flag, which they planted firmly in the canyon floor upon arrival. A clear statement of sovereignty. "Sheriff Dixon," Blackhawk called, his voice authoritative. "The tribal council has secured an emergency federal injunction against any alterations to this canyon pending resolution of the boundary dispute." He held up an official document bearing a federal court seal. Behind him, more vehicles were arriving. A news van from the regional television station and 2 more tribal police units. Dixon's face darkened as he saw his control of the situation slipping away. "This is county land, Blackhawk. Your tribal politics have no standing here." "Federal court disagrees," Blackhawk replied, approaching with the court order. "This injunction specifically prohibits any drilling, sampling, or removal of natural resources. It also forbids the displacement of current residents." The Horizon supervisor pulled Dixon aside for a heated private conversation, clearly unhappy with the developing situation. The deputies looked increasingly uncomfortable, especially as the news crew began setting up cameras. Sarah used the distraction to move closer to Blackhawk, positioning herself between the groups. "I have video evidence of the illegal drilling," she said quietly, "and their forced entry into Thomas's dwelling." Blackhawk nodded almost imperceptibly. "Where is Thomas?" Before Sarah could answer, a figure appeared on the eastern ridge. Thomas, bow slung across his back, walking openly along the canyon rim. All eyes turned upward as he made his way down a nearly invisible path, his movements sure and deliberate. He had removed his modern clothing, returning to the traditional Apache attire he wore when Sarah first met him. A murmur went through the assembled tribal members. The elder who had arrived with Blackhawk stepped forward, raising his hand in greeting or blessing. Thomas returned the gesture before continuing his descent. "Who authorized these news crews?" Dixon demanded, finally noticing the cameras being set up. "This area is restricted due to safety concerns." "Freedom of the press, Sheriff," called a reporter Sarah recognized from Willow Springs. "We received an anonymous tip about potential illegal mining activity on protected land. Quite a story developing here." Dixon's face contorted with barely controlled rage. He turned to the Horizon supervisor. "Pack it up. Now. We've already started the sampling." The man began to protest. "Now," Dixon repeated through clenched teeth. As the Horizon crew reluctantly began dismantling their equipment, Thomas reached the canyon floor. He approached not Dixon or the deputies, but the tribal elder, bowing his head respectfully. "Uncle," he said simply. The old man placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Nephew, you have been away too long." This simple exchange seemed to shift the energy of the confrontation. Thomas was not just a hermit, not just a former tribal police officer. He was family to respected elders, part of the community despite his years of self-imposed exile. Dixon, watching this reunion with growing frustration, made one final attempt to salvage his plan. "Mr. Redcloud," he called, "you're still wanted for questioning regarding the disappearance of James Riley 15 years ago." A hush fell over the canyon. Thomas turned slowly to face the sheriff, expression calm but resolute. "James Riley isn't missing," came a new voice from behind the tribal vehicles. All heads turned as a man in a wheelchair was helped from one of the tribal police trucks. Joseph Blackhawk's second-in-command, David Little Creek. "I found him 3 years ago in a hospice in New Mexico," Little Creek continued, "dying of liver cancer, ready to confess to his role in the school shooting and what really happened afterward." He handed a sealed envelope to Blackhawk, who presented it to Thomas. "Riley's sworn statement, notarized and filed with the federal prosecutor's office. He confirmed that he fell while running from you. You never touched him. He survived but was too injured to return." He also confirmed Dixon's role in helping the supremacist group establish their presence near the reservation. Dixon's hand moved to his weapon. "That's a damn lie." "It's all in the statement, Sheriff," Blackhawk interrupted, "along with details about certain financial arrangements with mining interests dating back 20 years. The FBI has been building their case quietly while we gathered additional evidence." As if on cue, 2 unmarked vehicles appeared at the canyon entrance. Men in suits emerged, credentials visible even at a distance. "Federal agents," Sarah explained to Thomas, who watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. "Joseph contacted them yesterday after we found the mining permits." The canyon that had known 15 years of silence now echoed with voices, movement, the mechanisms of justice finally turning. Dixon stood isolated, his deputies subtly distancing themselves as they recognized the shifting tide. Thomas turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "You planned this." "Joseph and I did," she admitted. "Once we had the evidence about Dixon's corruption, everything fell into place." Thomas glanced at the tribal flag now planted firmly in the canyon soil, then back to Sarah. "You've brought the world to my doorstep." "I've brought justice," she corrected gently. "The rest is your choice." 3 weeks passed like water flowing through the canyon, reshaping, renewing, revealing what had long been hidden beneath the surface. Sheriff Dixon faced federal charges for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Horizon Mining's permits were permanently revoked, their drilling equipment removed from the canyon under tribal supervision. Thomas's cave stood empty now, the wooden chest and few personal possessions moved to Joseph Blackhawk's home on the reservation while Thomas considered his next steps. The cave itself had been documented by tribal historians, its petroglyphs, natural features, and significance in sheltering one of their own during his years of self-imposed exile. Sarah had remained in Willow Springs, staying at the small hotel while finalizing her statement for federal prosecutors and completing the legal documentation to reinstate her law license. Her photographs of the canyon, both before and after the flood, had been featured in a special exhibition at the Tribal Cultural Center, drawing unexpected attention from environmental groups and art collectors alike. They had seen each other daily, but always surrounded by others. Tribal council members, federal agents, journalists seeking the full story of the hermit hero, and the corruption he had uncovered. The private connection that had grown between them in the cave's isolation remained unspoken, suspended in the rush of public resolution. Until today, Thomas had asked Sarah to meet him at the canyon, alone. She found him at the entrance to the cave, dressed in a careful balance of modern and traditional clothing, jeans and boots below, a ribbon shirt gifted by his uncle above. "It feels strange," he said as she approached. Seeing it from the outside, Sarah stood beside him, looking into the space that had sheltered them both. "Do you miss it?" "Parts," Thomas admitted. "The silence, the simplicity, the certainty of each day's purpose." He turned to her. "Other parts I'm ready to leave behind." They walked together along the rim trail they had built after the flood, now improved and marked by the tribal conservation team as a historic path. Below, the canyon continued its slow recovery, new growth already emerging from flood-scoured soil. "The tribal council has asked me to help establish legal protection for all the ancestral canyons," Thomas said after a comfortable silence, "working with the federal land management agencies to recognize traditional boundaries." "You'd be good at that," Sarah observed. "You understand both worlds." Thomas nodded, then added quietly, "They've offered me a house on the reservation. Nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, a garden space. Close to my uncle, but with privacy." Sarah felt her heart quicken at this oblique invitation. "Sounds perfect for a new beginning." They reached the spot where the petroglyph wall stood, newly protected by a discreet barrier that would preserve it without preventing respectful visitors from appreciating its significance. Thomas ran his fingers lightly over the ancient markings, then reached into his pocket. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said, withdrawing a small stone bowl of red ochre pigment. "For 15 years I existed. For 2 weeks with you, I remembered how to live." He dipped his finger in the ochre, then turned to the smooth stone beside the ancient petroglyphs. With careful, deliberate movements, he added a new marking, a simple design of interlocking circles. "My grandfather taught me that we don't just preserve the old stories," Thomas explained. "We continue them, add to them, make them our own." He offered the ochre to Sarah. "Will you add your mark beside mine?" Sarah understood the significance of this invitation, not just to mark the stone, but to join her story with his. She dipped her finger in the red pigment and carefully added her own symbol beside his, a flowing line that connected with his circles without diminishing them. Together they stepped back, viewing their addition to the canyon's millennia of human expression. "The Tribal Council has also asked me to consult on environmental cases," Sarah said, watching the sunlight play across their newly created petroglyph. "Using my legal background to protect not just this canyon but others throughout the Southwest." "Based here?" Thomas asked, the question containing others left unspoken. "That would be my preference," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I've had enough of running from one place to another. I'd like to stay, build something lasting." Thomas took her hand, their fingers still stained with ochre. "I meant what I said about the house having 2 bedrooms." Sarah smiled. "One for us, one for your grandfather's books and my camera equipment? That was my thought." They stood together at the canyon's edge, the future spreading before them like the vast Arizona sky. Neither was the same person who had entered the canyon weeks earlier. Thomas no longer hiding from his past, Sarah no longer running from her purpose. "There will be difficult days ahead," Thomas cautioned. "Standing between corporations and the land they want is never peaceful." "I know," Sarah agreed, "but we'll face them together." Thomas reached for the silver locket still hanging around Sarah's neck, the one that had belonged to his wife. With gentle hands, he removed it, then placed it carefully in a small niche beside their new petroglyph. "Anna would approve," he said quietly. "She always believed in moving forward, not just surviving." As the setting sun painted the canyon in golds and reds, Thomas and Sarah made their way down the trail they had built together. Behind them, The cave stood empty yet somehow not abandoned, a chapter in their story rather than its conclusion. And on the ancient wall, their new petroglyph caught the last light of day, two distinct symbols joined to create something neither would have made alone, adding their voices to the canyon's timeless conversation between past and future. Jamie's parents had brought him to visit the previous week, returning Mr. Hoppy to his rightful place in the boy's arms. But not before Thomas had shown Jamie how to make his own small mark on a stone near the trail, a child's simple drawing of a rabbit, joining his story to the canyon's enduring narrative. Like the land itself, they had been transformed by forces beyond their control, flood and fire, loss and love, emerging not unmarked but unbroken, ready to write the next chapter together.